He sat perfectly still in the dim light of his living room, a once powerful young factory worker now fighting a losing battle for a single, complete breath. The year was 1933, and inside his chest, a silent, irreversible transformation was taking place, turning his vital, healthy lungs into rigid, unyielding stone. Every attempt to pull air into his body was met with a terrifying, suffocating resistance, leaving him gasping and exhausted in his own armchair. He was not alone in this slow, agonizing suffocation, though the walls of his modest home made it feel like an entirely private nightmare. Across the industrial towns of America, thousands of strong, capable men were experiencing this exact same terrifying decline, their bodies betraying them long before their time. They were drowning in plain sight, entirely unaware that the very dust they brought home on their work boots was the architect of their destruction. This creeping paralysis of the lungs was not an accident of nature, but the direct, calculated byproduct of an industrial machine that prioritized unyielding expansion over human survival. Behind the towering brick walls of the era's booming chemical and manufacturing empires, a dark, invisible reality governed the daily lives of the workforce. Men labored in massive, cavernous rooms where the air itself was a thick, shimmering fog of microscopic daggers. Millions of tiny, jagged fibers of asbestos and clouds of fine silica dust floated freely through the poorly ventilated workspaces, clinging to skin, hair, and clothing like a second skin. When a worker took a deep breath of that dusty factory air, those microscopic, needle-like fibers traveled straight down their windpipes and lodged deep inside the soft, delicate tissue of their lungs. Because the human body has no way to break down or dissolve these sharp minerals, the lungs responded the only way they could, by building thick, tough scar tissue around every single fiber. Over months and years, this relentless scarring spread, slowly destroying the lungs' ability to stretch, expand, and transfer life-saving oxygen to the blood. The air they were paid to breathe was slowly suffocating them from the inside out, laying the groundwork for a massive, unfolding tragedy that the corporate architects were already working to conceal. The chilling tipping point arrived when a sudden, undeniable wave of severe sickness swept through the factory floors, devastating the ranks of the labor force. Young, athletic men in the prime of their lives suddenly found themselves stopping to rest after climbing a single flight of stairs, their chests heaving in panic. The raw terror set in when the relentless, dry hacking turned into coughing up blood onto the concrete floors, a grim signal that something inside them was fundamentally broken. A profound, paralyzing fear gripped the workers and their families as they watched their strongest friends wither away into fragile, gasping shadows of their former selves. They had no idea what invisible force was hunting them down, trading whispered rumors in the break rooms as more and more empty stations appeared on the assembly line. They were trapped in a terrifying mystery, entirely dependent on the very company that was poisoning them to tell them what was wrong. Desperate for answers and begging for relief, these terrified workers filed into the pristine, brightly lit company medical clinics, placing their absolute trust in the hands of corporate physicians. But instead of receiving medical care, these sick men walked into a carefully orchestrated trap designed to protect the company's bottom line. The doctors, fully aware of the lethal lung scarring showing up on the X-rays, looked these dying men in the eye and deliberately lied to them about their condition. The medical files were quietly altered, and the devastating truth of asbestos poisoning was buried under a mountain of fabricated, harmless diagnoses. Workers whose lungs were turning to stone were casually told they merely had a stubborn common cold, a bout of seasonal bronchitis, or simply naturally weak lungs that could not handle the physical labor. They were handed cough syrup, patted on the back, and sent right back into the deadly dust-choked factories to breathe in more of the poison that was killing them. The false diagnoses handed down in the company clinics were just the first line of defense in a much larger war against the dying. As the coughing worsened and medical bills piled up, desperate workers finally tried to file for compensation, only to walk into a carefully laid trap. Company lawyers sat across from men who could barely draw a breath and coldly told them the sickness was their own fault. They pointed fingers at the workers' daily habits, aggressively arguing that smoking, poor diet, or even the air in their home neighborhoods was to blame for the heavy scarring in their lungs. It was a calculated campaign of humiliation designed to make sick men give up and go away quietly. Widows seeking basic death benefits were dragged through grueling hearings, forced to listen to highly paid attorneys tear apart their husband's character and medical history. The legal team knew exactly what they were doing, using immense corporate resources to exhaust families who could not even afford basic groceries, let alone a drawn-out legal fight. Blaming the victims worked to deny individual payouts, but the corporation needed a broader shield to protect their entire empire from future claims. The battleground shifted from the courtroom to the laboratory, where the company used its vast wealth to buy the exact scientific conclusions it needed. They quietly poured millions of dollars into research institutions, funding studies that were heavily biased from the very start. The goal was never to find out how dangerous asbestos really was, but to manufacture doubt and create a thick fog of confusion around the facts. Paid researchers produced polished reports claiming the dust levels in the factories were perfectly safe, or that the specific type of fibers used by the company were somehow harmless. These bought and paid-for studies were then handed to government regulators and published in medical journals, creating a false reality that shielded the company from oversight. Real scientists who tried to warn the public about the deadly truth found themselves blacklisted, their independent research buried under an avalanche of corporate-funded lies. The stacks of rigged medical journals sat like armor on the desks of executives, providing the perfect cover story for the ongoing tragedy. But the true story of what those executives actually knew was locked away, hidden deep inside steel filing cabinets on the top floors of the corporate headquarters. Here, far away from the choking dust of the factory floor, men in tailored suits passed around confidential memos that laid out the stark, undeniable reality of the poison they were selling. They did not need independent scientists to tell them the dust was lethal, because their own private data already showed a massive spike in early deaths among their workforce. Instead of halting production or buying proper safety gear, these leaders sat in pristine boardrooms and did the terrible math of human life. They calculated exactly how much it would cost to install ventilation systems to save the workers, and then compared that number to the estimated cost of paying out a few scattered death claims. The documents proved that the executives chose the cheaper option, deciding it was more profitable to let the men slowly suffocate than to fix the machines. Those chilling internal memos remained buried in the dark, gathering dust for decades while the death toll on the factory floor continued to climb. When the first desperate workers finally gathered the courage to file lawsuits, they did not find justice waiting for them in the courtroom. Instead, they walked blindly into a meticulously designed legal meat grinder. The company unleashed a massive defense machine, funded by generations of inherited wealth, with a single objective to crush any claim before it could reach a jury. Corporate lawyers descended on these small factory towns, armed with unlimited resources and a terrifying mandate to deny everything. They treated the dying men not as victims of industrial poisoning, but as hostile threats to the corporate bottom line. The strategy was as simple as it was brutal. The legal team filed endless motions, demanded impossible medical records, and delayed hearings for months, and then years. They knew a terrible, undeniable truth about the disease ravaging their workers' lungs, knowing it was a death sentence with a rapidly ticking clock. The lawyers simply had to stall the legal process until the plaintiff was dead. Once a worker suffocated in his hospital bed, his lawsuit often died with him or was settled with his grieving widow for pennies on the dollar. The legal system was weaponized into a waiting game that the sick could never win. This deliberate strategy of exhaustion ensured that the company kept its billions while the graveyards filled with their former employees. The most unsettling mystery of this entire tragedy is not the chemical nature of the dust, but the psychological darkness of the men who hid it. These were not faceless monsters living in shadows. They were respected community leaders, philanthropists, and family men. They sat in pristine boardrooms, reviewing the rising mortality rates and the grim medical reports, and then they locked those papers away in steel filing cabinets. The disconnect between their private knowledge and their public actions reveals a chilling capacity for cognitive dissonance. How does a corporate executive leave a meeting where the acceptable death toll of their workforce is calculated, and then drive home to a quiet, affluent neighborhood? They sat down to warm dinners with their own children, attended Sunday church services, and slept soundly in comfortable beds, entirely insulated from the suffocating nightmare they were sustaining. They built a psychological wall so thick that the distant, gasping breaths of their dying workers could never penetrate their conscience. The true horror lies in how easily they normalized the sacrifice of human life for quarterly profits. That same ability to compartmentalize human suffering was on full display when internal company records from the 1970s eventually surfaced in civil courts. During sworn depositions, executives were forced to read their own signatures on memos that explicitly acknowledged the deadly nature of the factory dust. Yet even when confronted with the undeniable paper trail of their own calculated silence, they maintained a cold, practiced ignorance. The corporate culture had so thoroughly rewarded this blindness that the executives genuinely believed their duty to the shareholders absolved them of any moral duty to the dying. While the executives protected their legacies, the families of the fallen workers were left entirely shattered. As the men slowly wasted away, tethered to oxygen tanks in their living rooms, their wives and children became full-time caretakers, watching a horrific slow-motion execution. The trauma did not end when the breathing finally stopped. These families were plunged into immediate, crushing poverty, robbed not only of their fathers and husbands, but of the primary breadwinners that kept a roof over their heads. Adding profound insult to their devastating injury, these grieving families were repeatedly told by company doctors and defense lawyers that they were to blame. Widows were coldly informed that their husbands had died because they smoked, because they had weak constitutions, or because they failed to wear flimsy paper masks that offered zero real protection. The legal machine gaslit entire communities, leaving a generational scar of bitterness and unresolved grief. Children grew up in the shadow of the factories that killed their fathers, deeply aware that the justice system had abandoned them. The physical landscape of those factory towns remains permanently altered by this era of unchecked industrial power. Today, massive, rusted abatement zones stand in the center of these communities, surrounded by high chain-link fences and faded warning signs. The toxic dust that was once swept under the rug by corporate attorneys now requires specialized hazardous material teams in sealed suits to remove. The ground itself is considered a persistent threat, demanding millions of dollars in federal environmental remediation funds just to keep the soil from poisoning the next generation. These silent, contaminated sites serve as dark monuments to a legal and regulatory system that failed its most vulnerable citizens. The sprawling, empty lots are a permanent physical reminder of the true cost of corporate immunity. Decades after the last factory whistle blew, the environment remains scarred, holding the deadly fibers in the earth just as stubbornly as the courtrooms held back the truth. The legacy of the asbestos empire is not found in the grand estates of the executives, but in the poisoned soil and the quiet, grieving towns they left behind. The true cost of this deception was not measured in corporate fines, but in the quiet, systemic devastation of factory towns. When a worker's lungs finally failed, the financial burden fell entirely on their family. The corporate denial machine was designed to ensure that the very people who built the company's wealth were left to pay for their own slow demise, draining their modest savings just to afford oxygen tanks and basic hospice care. This calculated denial created a brutal generational trap for the communities left behind. Because the company doctors had successfully classified industrial poisoning as ordinary, unrelated sickness, countless widows were legally blocked from claiming death benefits. The strategy worked exactly as the executives intended, seamlessly transferring the massive financial liability of asbestos exposure away from the corporate ledger and directly onto the shoulders of the grieving families. When the internal documents finally breached the fortress of corporate secrecy in the late 1990s, the aftershock permanently altered the landscape of industrial accountability. The sheer volume of hidden medical records and cost-benefit memos introduced in courtrooms across the country shattered the long-held assumption that immense wealth could indefinitely bury the truth. This undeniable paper trail forced a massive legal reckoning, driving historic bankruptcies and compelling the creation of multi-billion-dollar compensation trusts. It proved that the calculated math of death, once hidden in locked filing cabinets, would eventually become the very evidence that tore the deception apart. Yet, long after the gavels fell and the final legal settlements were signed, the ultimate toll of this deception remains anchored in the quiet towns where the dust first settled. It is a cost that can never be balanced on a corporate ledger, measured instead by the empty chairs at family dinner tables and the faded photographs of those who traded their health for a paycheck. The factories may be closed, but the heavy, ragged breathing of the forgotten workers still echoes, a haunting reminder of the price paid when human life is treated as just another disposable cost of doing business.